So once again, thank you for joining us for the Primary Sources and Teaching Online webinar series brought to you by the TPS Western Region in partnership with the TPS Teachers Network. This next session, we're going to continue on with the presentation from Dr. Raleigh Schendel on listening skills for content access and.
All right, part two. So we're going to go ahead and jump forward and think about what are some other levels of listening that we might focus on to teach our learners how to listen for specific reasons, specific purposes. So going beyond the listen carefully, we now have kind of an idea of how we might tell our students, I want you to listen discriminatively. What sounds do you actually hear? Imagine teaching an emergent reader how to read based on discriminative listening and what specific sounds do you hear in this word. We also have learned a little bit about appreciative listening and how we might say, instead of carefully listen or listen carefully, listen appreciatively to this text. I want you to actually grab hold of how you feel about the audio and why you feel that way. What sounds evoke those emotions, and what does the speaker or the singer say or do to help you feel that way? How can you harness that and become a better communicator, essentially, which is our goal as teachers ultimately. So we're moving on, and we're going to learn 3 more levels of listening. And based on our first slide, or second or third slide, we're moving into precise listening. So go ahead and read through these bullets to understand precise listening. So to change the pace of the webinar just a little bit and to relinquish the scaffolding that's been provided, I'm a huge fan of parallel construction, but we're going to bend outside of that just a little bit. I want to ask you right now, based on these characteristics or attributes of precise listening, what texts or situations might you use precise listening for and with your students? So throw something in the chat, unmute and holler out a word or a phrase. I'm putting you on the spot, but you can do it. I know you have perfect ideas for how you can use this and teach this. When would I tell my students to listen precisely? Absolutely. Podcasts. You know, why am I sharing this podcast with you? Listening precisely should allow you to identify why. Oh, yes, excellent. Oral histories. Focusing on some of the sequence of lives. Read aloud, song lyrics. News conferences, absolutely. So the precision that's involved in making sense of that conference. What words are used and how are they associated? Absolutely. Debates. Excellent. Yeah. So we're going to go ahead and jump forward. We're going to focus on a few of these, and we're going to listen for key details, word association, and context as we listen to this.
It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas.
Phrases, focus on key details. We're going to listen to a few more seconds.
Yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night, the Japanese attacked Wake Island. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island.
Absolutely. How many of you in your own writing, in your own speaking, when you're teaching something very deliberately, very purposefully, and trying to get across this really key understanding or insight, use repetition? Deliberately, slowly. Absolutely. This is a prime example of an audio text that can be used to teach precise listening. But not only that, you could take this backwards and actually use this same audio and unveil it through discriminative listening. You're thinking in the chat box regarding, oh, I could use this, or this would be an integral way to transition from one perspective to another. So we're strongly about, well, the word sick in the context that they're using in association with the other words actually is something positive and powerful. So in some ways it's based on context. Could you use this speech as an example of how public gets information from a president? Yes, that would be a great, that's a great example of how you could use this, even this specific speech. Deliberate pacing, absolutely. We were looking at the length of this speech, and the actual transcript is only about 1.5 pages long, but it's 7.5 minutes recording wise. Pacing is absolutely everything. All right, we're going to go ahead and move forward. We've got a couple more listening levels to explore. The next one is strategic listening. Go ahead and take a moment to unpack the components of strategic listening. The author of Listen Here is Opitz and Sabraki. I'll jot it down while you kind of dig into strategic listening.
I got a link here. I'll post it in the chat.
Now, please realize that as I unpack these levels of listening with you, I'm following a different method than I probably would use with my learners, even older learners who can access information more rapidly than younger in some cases. I might teach a strategy or a listening level, one a day or one a week, or repeatedly over and over a particular level, and then move on to another when students start to generate conversation about, well, isn't that this? And we say, oh, well, is it? What does that have to do with this level of listening? Well, that doesn't quite fit. I wonder if there's another level that we could explore to understand the elements of listening. So strategic listening sounds like what? What does this strategic listening sound like? What does it align with? strategic reading, right? Reading strategies. The beauty of this is when you go back through all these listening levels, you realize they have intricate and integral connections to how we teach students to read. So the beauty of this is that we can kind of flip-flop back and forth, capitalize on, let's say, listening comprehension of our readers, all the while we're trying to develop their reading comprehension. So here we have strategic listening, connecting, summarizing, predicting, accommodating, understanding information, synthesizing, and we're going to go ahead and take a stab at using this with a read aloud. So bear with me for a moment. I'm going to conduct a read aloud. This read aloud uses the text teammates. This is it's a pretty incredible text about Jackie Robinson and one of his teammates as he was kind of challenged to change the world, so to speak. So I want you to listen strategically. So if we back up real quick, you're listening for connections, you're summarizing, you might be predicting, you're formulating questions, you're synthesizing information. Life was very different for the players in the major leagues. They were the leagues for white players compared to the Negro League players. White players were very well paid. They stayed in good hotels and ate in fine restaurants. Their pictures were put on baseball cards, and the best players became famous all over the world. Many Americans knew that racial prejudice was wrong, but few dared to challenge openly the way things were. And many people were apathetic about racial problems. Some feared that it could be dangerous to object. Vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan reacted violently against those who tried to change the way blacks were treated. The general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers baseball team was a man by the name of Branch Rickey. He was not afraid of change. He wanted to treat the Dodger fans to the best players he could find, regardless of the color of their skin. He thought segregation was unfair and wanted to give everyone, regardless of race or creed, an opportunity to compete equally on battlefields across America. To do this, the Dodgers needed one special man. Now I ask you, after listening strategically, what would make the man that he found, that Branch Rickey found, so special? What was necessary of this special person? Go ahead and jot your ideas down in the chat box. What kind of person did they need for this role? This takes a little bit of background knowledge on the story of Jackie Robinson, also on our history, particularly in America. What kind of attributes or characteristics might this player need? Absolutely, confidence. Yeah, cool-mannered. What is meant by cool-mannered? What are you thinking? Think about it. When you go back, keep going. When you go back to the text and you try think the way you do and you reread, many people were apathetic about racial problems. Some feared that it could be dangerous to object. So if some people, just random people, felt that it would be dangerous to object, what kind of person did they need to stand in the spotlight as the first of this type of baseball player, right? Works well in adverse situations, courageous, absolutely. I'll read on just a brief bit. It says, Branch Rickey launched a search for him. He was looking for a star player in the Negro Leagues who would be able to compete successfully. So think about it. I don't think anyone wrote that. They had to be good. You had to be really good in order to actually throw yourself or be thrown into this situation. To compete successfully, and despite threats on his life or attempts to injure him. He would have to possess the self-control not to fight back when opposing players try to intimidate or hurt him. If this man disgraced himself on the field, all was lost. Okay? The beautiful nature of strategic listening is we can use anything. So if you start with something smaller, maybe a lower level like discriminative and appreciative, where you're just getting the students to feel out the text, the audio, then you move on to something really powerful like strategic listening. And what does that have to do with student thinking, engaging them, helping them learn more, learn further? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move forward. After this, we're going to jump on to critical listening. And what I want you to do is think about critical listening in terms of bias. You know, where do we think about bias? Is it around us? Is it prevalent? Speakers' inferences, without actually saying something specifically or literally, what are they trying to say? What's their message? This is a really powerful part of our environment right now, and that's fact and opinion. What is fact? What's opinion? Especially with this pandemic, what's real? What are we supposed to trust? What are we supposed to believe? And not only that, but this may sound pretty familiar. Absolutely, fake news. This correlates directly with how we teach our students to unpack and make sense of primary sources and evaluating where they came from, who produced them. Is there bias in every source, whether it's primary, secondary, or otherwise? Jump forward into our text, and I want you to see if you can identify the speaker's bias and reveal and or unearth some of the inferences that are made in this text.
One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with.
What inferences are being made? What biases are evident?
Able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado.
I think we'll pause there at Colorado. Move forward just a little bit. The first slam poetry ever. I love that. We're going to go ahead and jump forward. And this is a point where I'd like you to start to shout out ideas that you have, questions that you have. Certainly unmic if you have an idea for teaching listening that is just like percolating within you, and it's gotta come out, and you want to throw it out there for the rest of the or whatever. So this is your space for a moment. Go for it.
Okay, so I wonder if you were to have people listen to different parts of the speech, so split it up, and have students listen to different components, could you jigsaw it back together to talk about bias, content, and put the story together? It kind of leaves out beginning and end, but I wonder about how the inquiry and how that would work in regards to listening. They'd have to focus really tightly on what they were doing, but coming back together as a group, I wonder if it would give the whole picture and then listen to the narrative after what would happen. Have you done that, Raleigh?
Yeah, actually, we've done variations of that. Before I share that, I want to give any other audience member the opportunity to kind of chime in and give an insight or a suggestion based on what Michelle just said. So a moment, if you want to take the opportunity, and then I'll share these ideas. Anyone?
Can you repeat what was said? Because I was typing and I wasn't listening.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take a moment. If someone wants to jump in and answer or provide some feedback based on Michelle's question just now, her idea, this is your chance to jump in, and I'll share what we've tried before and ideas for what we're going to try in the future. So the question is jigsawing listening levels with a speech like "I have a dream."
Do you mean like jigsawing listening levels? Like you'd have a group of 4 students and they'd each be focused on a different listening level while listening to something?
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. Let me go ahead and share some ideas that we've used. Let's see. So Kyle writes, the transcript would be essential for a jigsaw. I think at some point the transcript might be essential, but I still would like to think of this in terms of like gradually releasing variations in text difficulty. So you still have students that may not be able to access the written text as well as they can the audio, and or vice versa. So here's one example of how we've tried the jigsaw process. We've tried it by using the same source, and each group actually is assigned a different listening level, and they listen to that text, that audio, through the lens of their level. So one group's listening discriminatively to the speech here by Martin Luther King, and another group at the same time is listening appreciatively. A fine example of what this allows learners to do is take your whether or not I repeat certain words, how effective I am as a speaker. Go think about Obama, President Obama versus President Trump. When you're listening to them and how they speak, you may not be able to access what they're actually saying. So one thing that jigsawing allows us to do is compartmentalize these listening levels and the thinking that may be involved with a level for learners to allow them to access and become kind of the expert on that level of the text based on the level. Then we bring it together and they get to share. Go ahead.
I also think, there's that breakdown of how much we learn by reading and listening and experiencing. And it's with this concept of jigsawing listening levels, it's like they're experiencing listening in a way where these concepts will stick with them.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. And that's what we've found when we've used this in our social studies methods class, Kyle and Keith and I, with some of the PD that we've done. One other way to think about this is imagine one of your favorite songs, something that you just love the beat, right? It's really got a beat you can dance to. Wasn't that some show we watched, American Bandstand or whatever? you love the pace, you love the cadence, you love the chime, you love the rhythm, but some point you learned, okay, these are the lyrics? What? I didn't have any idea that it actually said this. So that reminds us that we've been listening appreciative all this time. We've maybe been listening discriminatively, but we haven't really been listening critically or listening strategically to make sense of what it's actually saying, right? We may be like, that's one of my favorite songs, but the actual lyrics itself are inappropriate or adverse or challenging or otherwise. Any other ideas or questions? I have a couple more that I'm going to share before we're done, but I wanted to give you another chance to jump in. Questions, ideas, insights?
There's a good one from Carrie Veach here that says, have students record historical speech they haven't heard and compare where they put the emphasis in pauses, speed, vocal expression, what they believe to be important parts of the speech, etc. I think it would help learners understand a document better by recording it because they have the choice, cadence, expression, emotions, point, etc. through their understanding.
Absolutely. Oh, incredible. Yeah, beautiful, Carrie. One thing that I want to share is, I think about power. Absolutely. One idea that just jumped back into my head that I haven't tried forever, but I used to with my kids in the elementary classroom, and that was assign them an audio and then have them evaluate and or examine the audio for the levels of listening that could be taught and or are necessary to be used to understand it. So then they label the audio with the particular levels of listening that are appropriate for that text, that audio text. Another idea that I want to share, we tried this last semester with the students in our social studies methods class, and it was with Hitler and Roosevelt, a folk song that talks about those two characters. And we actually, this lesson probably spanned, what would you guys say, an hour and a half? And we had them listen. It's a really poor recording, which is beautiful because you're like, oh my gosh, I can hardly hear that. So we have them listen how? Discriminatively. What sounds do you hear? Who do you hear? What's going on in terms of like other instruments, of pacing, of the bits and pieces. So it's the C of see, think, wonder, right? So they unpack it. Then when we have them write, we have them talk, and then we have them listen to it again. Right after that, listen to it appreciatively. And so they listen to it through an appreciative lens. And weirdly, it becomes more and more clear. Like, even though it's a really poor recording, it just becomes clearer and clearer. And they listen to it how? Precisely, strategically, then critically. And the story of what's being told and showcased just unfolds in this amazing tapestry of interwoven threads. It was so beautiful. And the students' insights and their unrest and the questions that were generated. By the way, this could be a very, very powerful connection to using the RQI, right? Question formulation technique of the RQI. But once they got to that fifth listening and listened to it critically, guess what they were ready for? The actual script. So then we gave them the script and they listened to it one more time and read the script and were able to pick out some details that maybe they were unable to hear, draw further connections, the power between listening and reading, and then help them understand, okay, how might you use this in a classroom with learners, and what did it do for you? Who wasn't even interested at the beginning, and most of them were like, I don't know. How many of you were interested and engaged in this? And all of them were just raptured. They were like white knuckling this learning experience. It was so invigorating. It was a beautiful thing. Questions, comments, other ideas?
Thinking back to another workshop that we did, Raleigh, with the levels of listening, I remember having primary sources that paired with the audio, and then we would have them close their eyes and listen to the music or the speech, and then the next go around you have them open the eyes and then only stare at the primary source, so they can't be looking around the room, just the primary source, and see what kind of connections that the students can make through the primary source and the audio.
Oh yeah, beautiful. Absolutely. That was amazing. What other ideas might you have? What's going on in your heads? You know, I know you have an abundance of time to explore and think about the listening levels and how you might captivate your learners. Just off the top of your head, thinking aloud. Slave narratives as readers' theater, absolutely. Yeah, and you know, that you're absolutely right, because you can actually teach a reading activity and enhance it by focusing on and or showcasing, you know, shining a light on a listening level. Like, what about that piece right there? How are we going to make that make greater sense? What level of listening did I use to identify it? What could I use to help it make greater sense to everyone else, the audience? Any other ideas, questions? So I am available through the bit.ly, through the links that are associated with this webinar. You can certainly reach out to me. I'd love for you to reach out and say, I tried it in this way. Oh my gosh, you got to listen to this. So I can try it as well. Or reach out if you have questions, if you want resources, if you need support. Situation that we are right now, teaching remotely and thinking, how can I give learners access to text? There's so much audio out there, and predominantly our students are you know, spending most of their days just listening powerful decisions, to think about others, to do the right thing, to grow as members of our society. I think the listening levels are absolutely imperative to helping us make sense of the world for our learners. I encourage you and challenge you to continue studying the levels of listening, and for you to just start to gather text sets. What do you have out there? What's available? What podcast can you grab hold of and share with your learners and enrich their lives? Nice. Thanks, Patty. I appreciate that. I'm going to jump forward and I'm going to close and pass it on to Kyle. I appreciate all of you. It was delightful speaking to you, listening to your thoughts and reading them on the screen. I hope you got something out of this, at least one thing that can help propel your teaching and your learners' learning.
Raleigh, thank you so much. And I might just ask you one question.
Yep.
Would you just go into a little bit of how and maybe why you chose the primary sources for each of those categories, and why it's important maybe to unpack all of them in one, or unpack just one of the categories, or that kind of thing?
Yeah, so just a brief explanation of this. Kyle and I were kicking around ideas for setting this up and finishing the planning, and I was asking him about sources, and I said, well, what source might be best for this level? And he's like, isn't every source best for every level? And I'm like, yeah, that's one way to look at it, but some sources reveal themselves more obviously through a particular listening level. So we talked a little bit more about that, and what I really realized was, you know, I was coming about this, you know, you either come about it through an inductive or a deductive process, essentially, and I was turning it into this kind of inquiry-based process where I was just going out into the world and looking for examples of what might fit each source. So I would encourage you to just grab something that's killer, something that's interesting to learners, and use it with any and all of the levels. But I wouldn't stop at gathering that one or those dozen. I would stop myself. I'd force my learners to actually acquire the texts and bring in the audio and share that and connect it to the levels of listening. So I hope that gives a little bit of an answer to your question, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I'll pause just for maybe 30 seconds to see if there's any more questions, and then we can
Sure.
wrap it up.
Raleigh, have you ever brought a group of sources together, like audio, print, etc., and had just a pile of them, and had students do the listening levels around it to sort them and put a story to them?
I've never had them do a story, but you just gave me goosebumps. It's like where we want to go. As a result of teaching the listening levels, we want to go somewhere really purposeful like that, like then connect all these, tell the story. I have actually had them sort when I talked about finding a source and actually identifying the levels that would be most powerfully connected to that. That turned into, in a lot of cases, a sorting activity. But I love the extension of moving on to telling a story and piecing them together. Yeah, like a really purposeful audio text set that tells this story.
Yeah, the
Beautiful.
before, the after, and then use it. You could almost go into an inquiry process to have them then add on and bring stuff to it. Just makes me wonder, I don't know, makes me wonder.
And think about the story that's told every night or all day long. When I visit my folks and they're either listening to Fox News or CNN or whatever they're listening to, there's an audio story that's being put together there with clips from presidents, from other officials, things revolving around this situation. Absolutely. That's a beautiful real world connection, Michelle.
Just wondered.
The other thing, Raleigh, that Michelle's question made me think of is getting those picture books and having just the pages and mixing them all around, and then having the kids recreate the story through the picture books, not knowing what the page numbers are.
Yeah, and I've actually used that process, but not in an auditory sense. But I like jumping back because I jotted down this idea in terms of reader's theater. You can get cut aparts, or when your picture books fall apart, or you lose a chapter in your adolescent novel in your classroom. Don't get someone who's volunteering to tape that thing back together. Purposefully chop the thing up, remove the page numbers, and then have your students reading those portions and putting it together through that audio exposure. I love that idea, Kyle.
Well, and Patty just mentioned something about Zoom too. She said, I use that with the book Zoom.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's almost over.
Nice. Okay. Well, thank you all again for attending. And thank you, Raleigh, for hosting us today. And thanks for Keith and Crystal for manning the chat room. And of course, to the Library of Congress for making all these webinars possible through the TPS program. As a reminder, for those who would like a professional development certificate, here's the link. It's up online. It's bit.ly/PS Teaching Online. Also, all resources will also be shared with the TPS Teachers Network in an album, a collaborative album on there, and also on the TPS Colorado YouTube page. So thanks again, and hope you all have a good night.